UC Davis Distinguished Speaker Series in Research and Innovation. This is a new series we are starting from this year. We will have approximately around 3 to 4 speakers spread over the entire year going forward. And this speaker series was designed for our campus faculty, staff, and students to hear and engage with luminaries in both academic research and innovations. The lecture series is envisaged to highlight the work of leaders in diverse disciplinary areas where research and achievements are having an impact on the society through the advancement of knowledge, scientific research, and evidence-based decision making. It will also provide an opportunity for the campus researcher to meet and network amongst themselves and leverage collaborations within our campus. This series will be hosted by the Office of Research and occasionally in partnership with other research units across the campus. And this particular event is being co-hosted by the Institute of Global Nutrition, which is dedicated to improving nutrition and health of vulnerable populations worldwide through research, training, and outreach. It has achieved international reputation for rigorous research, particularly in the areas of nutritional assessment, design of interventions, and evaluation of their impacts, primarily for women and children. I will be turning you over to its director, Dr. Christine Stewart, who is Corinne Restisi Endowed Chair in Applied Human Nutrition. Before that, I would like to quickly remind you that we will have refreshment in the lobby right after this talk, so you can hang around and socialize and interact with the speaker after the talk. Dr. Stewart will introduce our guest speaker at this hour.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that kind introduction. It's my pleasure to welcome and introduce our guest speaker for today, Dr. Lawrence Haddad. Dr. Haddad serves as the Executive Director for the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, a foundation that was created to tackle the human suffering caused by malnutrition. Their purpose is to improve consumption of nutritious and safe foods for all, with a core focus on children, adolescents, and women. They work through national, regional, and global alliances that provide technical, financial, and policy support to a range of public and private organizations, concentrating on where people get their foods from, markets. And they give priority to finding ways to change and improve how businesses and governments shape food systems for improved nutrition. So, prior to joining GAIN, Dr. Haddad was the founding co-chair and lead author of the Global Nutrition Report. He served in a number of important capacities, formerly as director of the Institute for Development Studies and the director of the Food Consumption and Nutrition Division at the International Food Policy Research Institute. And he additionally has served as the UK representative on the steering committee of the high-level panel of experts of the UN Committee on World Food Security, as well as the president of the UK and Ireland Development Studies Association. So by way of background, as an economist, he completed his PhD in food research at Stanford University. And an aside, he's told us that he actually applied to UC Davis to do his master's. And although he got in, he wasn't offered a fellowship here. So he went elsewhere. I think this is our major loss. So to all of the fellowship committees out there, look carefully at your applicants. So finally, in 2018, he was awarded the World Food Prize together with David Navarro in recognition of, quote, their extraordinary intellectual and policy leadership in bringing maternal and child nutrition to the forefront of the global food security agenda and thereby significantly reducing child stunting. So with that, I would like to ask you to please join me in welcoming our speaker to the podium.
Thank you, Vice Chancellor, and thank you, Christine. It's not too late to give me a fellowship. I'm really delighted to be here, and thank you all for coming and coming to listen. And I've had a great day and a half here in your wonderful campus. I met lots of very smart and interesting and fun people. So I'm going to try and do this in about 40 minutes. There's 20 minutes or so for Q&A. By the way, you may think I only have one shirt. That shirt is the same color as I have more than one shirt. So this is my title, Moving Towards Healthier Food Systems, Why and How. Can you hear me okay at the back? Yeah. So I'm going to briefly remind those of you who may not know what a food system is or what it looks like, what it is. Tell you about why they need to be healthier, and then how they can be healthier, and then how to get from there, and how to get there from here. Because very often we know what to do about how to make a food system healthier, but we just haven't figured out the incentives that need to be changed to help us get there. So I'm going to spend most of my time actually on how to get there from here. So this is my first lovely, non-complicated diagram. This is a typical description of what a food system is. A simple way to think about it is everything that's involved from getting food from the farm to the fork. That's the simple way. And very often we think a lot about farmers and we think a lot about consumers, but we forget about the stuff in between. We forget about the processors, the retailers, the wholesalers, the marketers, the advertisements. All of that stuff is really, really important. So at the top, you have the drivers, the big things that are changing the environment that we're living in, climate, urbanization, bad governance, those kinds of things. You have the food supply chains, which is partly production, but it's much more than production. The food environment, which is where the consumer comes face to face with food, whether it's in markets or schools or hospitals or hotels. A lot of individual factors that are important: education, income, consumer behavior. How do I respond to all of these prompts prompts and nudges when it comes to buying food? And then obviously, what is the impact on diets, and what is the impact of those diets on nutrition and health? So I'm going to be talking a bit more about that. But first of all, I'm going to remind us what the problem is. The problem is that 1 in 3 people on the planet are malnourished. This is outrageous, and it cannot stand. One of the big ways to address this is through our food systems. Our food systems are not broken, they're just pointing in the wrong direction. They're pointing towards the mass production of food that's not terribly healthy, that has a commercial return. So we just have to reorientate and re-incentivize our food system to produce more affordable, healthy foods that don't wreck the planet and generate livelihoods. So here's the number around hunger, chronic hunger. You see this number a lot. 820 million people don't get enough food to eat, no matter what kind of food it is. Then we have another 2 billion that are deficient in vitamins or minerals. They get enough food to eat, but they're not eating enough of the right kinds of foods, and they will suffer a whole range of mortalities and morbidities and mortality. Then we have, these circles haven't come out terribly well, but we have a lot of problems with kids under the age of 5. They're stunted, which means they're too short for their age. They look like they're 4, but they're really 8. They're wasted. These are the kids who are literally skin and bone, and you see them in UNICEF ads and Save the Children ads. And then there are an increasing number of kids under the age of 5 that are overweight. In fact, there are nearly as many kids overweight under 5 as there are kids who are wasted. And then we have 1.9 billion, and that number is probably a bit bigger now because that's 2017 or 18 number, who are overweight or obese. And I say 1 in 3 people are worldwide malnourished. We don't really know how these overlaps work. You can be malnourished, you can be deficient in vitamins and minerals in the big blue circle, but you can also be overweight and obese. So we don't really know what the overlaps are, but we think it's about 1 in 3 people worldwide who are malnourished. And increasingly what we're seeing is, and this is a really complicated diagram, I don't know why I put it in there, sorry, but what I'm trying to show here is that when I started out doing this, most countries either have a undernutrition problem, not enough food, not enough of the right kind of food, or they had an overweight obesity problem. Not that many of them did actually, but now you find at least 80, what did I say, 85 countries that have major public health problems of undernutrition, not enough food, care, and health, and major overweight problems. So it's getting really complicated, and the only way really through this is through fixing our food systems. And what's at the center of all of these types of malnutrition, all of these manifestations? The common denominator is unhealthy diets. Of course, it's not the only thing that matters for these things. Safe water, good sanitation, good health care, good maternal and paternal care for children, open exercise spaces, all sorts of things are also incredibly important. But food is the common denominator in all of this. So that begs the question, what is a recommended healthy diet? Another really busy diagram for you to glance at. There is no, if you go to the World Health Organization or FAO, they don't give you too much guidance on what is a standard reference healthy diet. They're working on it, they're trying to develop it, but this gives you a sense of how much debate and difference there is about around the world what is a healthy diet. These are data around food-based dietary guidelines. So the US has some dietary guidelines directing consumers, recommending what they should eat in what proportions and what frequencies, and every country pretty much has them, but they all tell a different story. And this graph is just trying to illustrate for 4 different categories of countries: high income, low income, and the 2 middle income categories. What percentage of them, for example, recommend eat a variety of foods? A different percentage for different kinds of countries. So there's no real consensus on what is a healthy diet, other than very broad, sensible principles about diversity is really important, consuming from a number of different food groups is important, don't eat too much highly processed foods, processed meats are particularly unhelpful, high diets that are high in added sugar, trans fats are not good. But beyond that, there's not too much specificity. I personally don't think that's a big problem, because I think the direction of travel as to what is a healthy diet is pretty clear. Eat more fruits and vegetables, eat more pulses, eat more nuts, that kind of thing. And I don't think it changes the policy recommendations and the policy directions we have to take. Now, just to give you a sense of how important diet is in terms of the burden of disease. The burden of disease is just a metric for adding up premature mortality and morbidity. And this group in Seattle, the IHME, puts these numbers together. They put them together for every country, and for the US, they put them together for the states. And then they say, okay, for this country, Ethiopia, what are the risk factors that are driving this burden of disease? And here you can see I've listed, on the right-hand side of the panel, I've listed the top 10 risk factors for 2017. And you can see that 5 of the top 10 burden of disease factors in Ethiopia, the ones I've circled in red, are related to diet in one way or another. So 5 of the top 10 risk factors generating all the morbidity and the premature mortality in Ethiopia are related to diet. So you might think, well, that's just Ethiopia, right? Well, actually, it's the same in California. These are the numbers for California. 5 of the top 10 risk factors generating the California burden of disease are related to diet. So poor diets and food systems that don't work are really a global phenomenon. Every country, every state has them. And so everyone has a stake in trying to fix them up. So how do we fix them up? How can they be healthier? There's loads of things we can do. We kind of know what to do, actually, in food supply chains. We can do a lot of rebalancing, a lot of agricultural R&D, a lot of subsidies, a lot of policies at the government and state level are geared towards producing staple crops, corn, wheat, rice. And that's very important. But there's a real imbalance, especially in Africa and Asia. Not enough of that, not enough of those resources are going into fruits, vegetables, pulses, and so on. We know we have to reduce food loss because the foods that are most perishable tend to be the foods that are most nutritious. We know we have to do that. And we know that companies need to be incentivized with carrots and sticks to do a better job of reformulating their products. less sugar, less fat, less salt, smaller sizes. In food environments, we know that we need to support national small and medium enterprises, SMEs, because that's where most people who are most malnourished, and certainly in Africa and Asia, they buy their food from small and medium enterprises. So we need to support those to produce more at a lower price. Food price subsidies and taxes, you've all heard of sugar taxes. They're popping up all over the place, but we need a more coherent approach to subsidizing things that are good and taxing things that are bad for health. We need to do workforce programs, which 1 billion people throughout the world are employed. That's a brilliant environment within which they spend 8, 10, 12 hours a day to improve their ability to make it easier for them to access healthy food. We need clean food labeling and clear food labeling as well. Under individual factors, we need to link nutritious food choices to cash transfer programs. There are lots of cash transfer programs targeting the bottom 10 or 20 or 30% of the income distribution throughout the world. Some of them are conditional, some of them are not. Where they are conditional, you get this cash transfer if you do X, Y, and Z. Very few of the X, Y, and Zs are linked to consuming healthier food. And then we need to create more aspirational food advertisements. I'll talk a bit about that later on. Most public service announcements to encourage us to consume more food are deadly boring and deadly dull, and no one pays any attention to them. For consumer behavior, we have to do more in schools to teach healthy eating. My daughter just graduated last year from school. She learned virtually nothing in a school about healthy eating. She learned how to bake cookies, but very little else. Technology needs to make it easier for consumers to purchase healthy food. A lot of US supermarkets now are getting these apps which tell you which say, you've bought this, you could have bought something else that was roughly equivalent but healthier. And we need to make that kind of technology more available. But the key issue really is, we know kind of what to do, but the incentives to make this happen are very weak. So I really want to focus mostly on the incentives. How do we get from where we are to a healthier food system? So I'm going to work through 7 drivers or shapers of incentives and say, what do we need to do? So incentive number 1 is we need to wake up governments to prioritize healthy diets. Most governments in low and middle income countries haven't yet clocked that their food systems are wrecking the health systems, their food systems are wrecking the environment. They haven't quite figured that out yet because they've just overcome hunger. And they're kind of feeling good about that. And they should feel good about that. But now we're saying, actually, your food system, having overcome hunger, is now killing your population and wrecking the environment. So we need to wake them up to do that, because only then will they begin to even think about repurposing policies and agricultural R&D. So it's not enough to say they need to repurpose policies and ag R&D. What is the trigger to make them do that? So the trigger, I'm going to give you one or two examples of triggers that we think are quite useful from our work in GAIN. So one trigger is to have a national food systems action plan, or a national food action plan. There's only one country in the world that has one, and that's the government of Norway. And this is the preface to that national food action plan. And you can see it's signed by all the ministries in Norway. It's the only country that has it. So that's one thing we need to be pushing very hard for. It's a soft entry point, but it's an important one. But if we want to get a bit more aggressive and a bit more confrontational and a bit more shaking the cage up, we can do things like this thing we're doing in Bangladesh with a number of our partners, where we are saying we're getting 1 million signatures from adolescents in Bangladesh who are saying we will spend some of our very tiny amounts of pocket money on healthier foods if you, the government, provide more healthy foods, and if you, small vendors around our schools, if you supply more healthy foods at a lower price. If you do that, vendors, we will give you our seal of approval, our pocket money pledge seal of approval. And so this is a way of using civil action and using and working with adolescents as agents of change to wake the government up. Most governments are sleeping and sleepwalking into around unhealthy food systems. Second thing is, how do we shift consumer preferences? If consumer preferences don't shift, it's going to be really hard to drive food systems away from where they are now into a healthier space. Every business I talk to, they say, if consumers would demand healthier foods, we would provide them. That's a bit disingenuous because businesses shape preferences. Let's face it, they shape demand. But nevertheless, I think in the public sector, we've been spectacularly unsuccessful at devising really exciting, innovative, engaging campaigns for healthy eating. So, this is an example. Nutritious foods are so badly losing the desirability war. This Go for 2+5 is a public campaign in Australia, and that doesn't excite me. That poster of the apple and the orange and the 5 vegetables. That really doesn't excite me. Look at the private sector counterpart that it's having to come up against. You can never be too thin. The aspiration is around thinness and looks, and they're linking that to thin chocolate-covered pretzels. So it's actually brilliant marketing. It's just working on the wrong foods from a public health perspective. So we've been experimenting in game with lots of stuff. This is one that was too racy for the Kenyan population. It was generated by a Kenyan ad agency, and we tested it out. And people were laughing so hard they didn't get the message. So we decided not to use this one. We ended up using this one. And we've been testing this one out, and now we're going to scale it and see whether it changes attitudes, knowledge, and crucially practices. But this is all around aspirations. It's not saying you must eat more nutritious food. It's saying, what do you care about, and how can we link nutrition and nutritious food to that? And it turns out that the aspiration was from people who were quite mature. That I'm a self-made person. Well, this is what made me. And a big part of what made these prominent people in Kenya was the food they ate as kids, the healthy food they ate as kids. So we've tried to key in on that. So I don't know if these are going to work or not, but we need to get more of the right brain thinking, where you have color, emotion, aspiration, and fun, and the left brain thinking, which is the science and the logic. And those two things need to be blended much more than they are right now. So the third incentive, how do we build employee awareness and activism? Because that will demand from employers a change. How do we do that? There's some really interesting studies around from the US in the business literature about what are employees looking for from their companies, and why do they join their companies? And they more and more, especially the younger generation, are looking for companies that have purpose. They want to be employed. They want to feel good about working with companies that have a purpose. So strangely, there are the International Labour Organization and a number of other organizations. They have these better work programs where you're trying to generate decent work for employees, especially low-income employees in countries where the regulatory framework is not very strong and where unions are not very strong. But nutrition is absolutely missing. So we are working with a number of companies to try to build nutrition into these workforce well-being programs. And we just did an evidence review, and the evidence is really, I was surprised at how strong it is. Reduced absenteeism, enhanced productivity, reduced medical costs, returns on investment of up to 6 to 1. A company invests $100,000 in a workforce program for nutrition, it will get 6 times that, up to 6 times that back in terms of improved productivity, reduced absenteeism, reduced turnover of staff. So that's another way of building a momentum, trying to change the incentives. Another way of trying to change the incentives is to build investor awareness. There's a bigger and bigger class of investors, especially pension investors, public investors, that are trying to find companies that adhere to the ESG principles, environment, social, and governance principles. Good companies who are responsible. But again, the ESG principles, environmental, societal, governance, nutrition is nowhere in those. So can we generate mechanisms that say, here are companies that are really responsible with nutrition, pension funds, you should be investing in those. Can we get coalitions of investors to say, this is what we expect from responsible companies in the nutrition space? And we are working with a group called the Access to Nutrition Foundation to do just that. Just to give you a sense of how badly the companies do, this is a survey that the Access to Nutrition Foundation did in 2018. They looked at 22 of the largest food and beverage companies, and they took a subsample, it's a big subsample, of 23,000 product lines, food product lines, of those 22 companies. There were many more. They then rated them by what's called a health star rating. So 5 is absolutely fantastic, 0 is the worst junk food you can think of. And they said, what percentage of those products meet a 3.5 out of 5 rating? And they found out 32% of those 23,000 product lines met a 3.5 out of 5 rating. So that's exactly the kind of metric that big institutional investors could say, we are going to invest only in companies that meet 2 out of 5, or 3 out of 5, or 4 out of 5. And we are working on that. The fifth one is developing new finance mechanisms. Behavior tends to follow money, right? If there's enough money being pumped into nutritious food, innovations will follow. All sorts of things will follow. Creativity will follow. Most of the big blended finance, where you blend maybe multinational or development finance, which is concessional, with private sector and private finance, plus impact investing, which is where you invest in something and you expect a commercial return, but you also demand a social impact, nutrition in this case. Impact investing and blended finance have been allergic to nutrition, partly because we in the nutrition and food space, healthy food space, haven't done enough to entice them in, partly because they are quite ignorant about what the issues are around food systems and health. So we are working on a finance facility to support small and medium enterprises. Now, you might say, small and medium enterprises are small and medium, and how can they generate scale? And that is an issue that we are worrying about. But the real fact is that in Africa, for example, most people buy their food from SMEs. Most of the food that is produced, handled, traded, and marketed is from small and medium enterprises. So if we want real food systems that local people depend on to be more nutritious, we have to invest in those SMEs. The way to do it, and the way to scale it, is through a fund. We are setting up a nutritious food financing facility, which will be worth about 60 million. It's a demonstration pilot. We are getting a pipeline of small and medium enterprises lined up that we think have a really good business case for producing more nutritious foods at a lower price. And we are matching them up through the fund managers with private investors who are willing to take a slightly lower commercial return in return for a bigger nutrition impact. We'll see how it goes. We think it stands every chance. And if it does work, we then want the $1 billion funds and the $10 billion funds to pick it up as a window and scale it. The sixth one is through strengthening accountability. The food system is pretty unaccountable. There's very, very weak accountability feedback loops. If you're doing bad things for nutrition, you can get away with doing it forever, pretty much, as long as the customer doesn't mind too much. So how do you strengthen accountability? So again, this is an incentive. We need to get stronger. Well, weirdly enough, we've got, this is a bit of a fuzzy slide, sorry. What I'm trying to convey in this slide is that there are lots of accountability mechanisms. In fact, I think there are now too many in nutrition. And the companies are now saying, hey, there's too many accountability mechanisms. We can't set up units of 5 people just to service these accountability mechanisms and their reporting requirements. So having too many accountability mechanisms is actually weakening accountability. So we are working with all of these different mechanisms and some of the big companies to try to get from this situation on the left where there are a ton of accountability mechanisms. They're all overlapping, they're not coherent. We're trying to get them into it will never be this tidy on the right, but we're trying to get them to not be so duplicative, and we're trying to get them to speak to each other so that companies only have to report only have to rely on 1 or 2 sets of data and make reports to 1 or 2 sets of mechanisms. Those mechanisms can then apportion out who does what. So that work, we're doing that for the big Japan summit that's coming up at the end of the year. Very difficult because every accountability mechanism loves itself. They don't want to play with each other, but they're going to have to. And finally, data and evidence-based data. If we get better data on our food systems, if we can describe our food systems, we can diagnose them and we can figure out where we need to act first and fastest. But at the moment, there's no mechanism that pulls all the data together across the food system into some kind of dashboard. So we, again, have been working with, it's a fancy slide, we've been working with Johns Hopkins and a couple of other universities to pull together a food systems dashboard. That's going to go live in the next couple of months. It basically has 150 indicators that are situated in that picture of the food system I showed you earlier. Now, at the moment, it's just a database, and it's been quality graded and organized, and there's a really nice interface, so it's very user-friendly. But what we have to do now is give countries sort of a heat map of where they're doing well, where they're in the green space, where they're in the orange space, and where they're in the red space. If they're in the red space for food loss and food waste, we then can link that hotspot to 10 interventions that seem to have worked well in similar countries elsewhere in the world. That's the goal over the next year, is to do that. So these are the 7 incentives I think we have to get right if we're going to change our food systems and get some of those policies in place. We know what policies to put in place. It's just that the food system actors don't have the incentives to do it. So we're trying to focus on the incentives. There's a big opportunity to push this agenda further forward with this Tokyo Nutrition for Growth Summit in 2020. And we again and others are working really hard to push these 7 incentives forward for that. I think my final slide is, data are important, evidence is important, all of these incentives are really important, but dialogue is really, really important. Understand, food systems are businesses, but ultimately it's about people, people talking to other people and understanding other people's perspectives. So these things are fine. Happiness, what's that say? Working conditions and self-love, those things are important. But these are the things that we need dialogues on how do you build demand for healthier food? How do you reduce the affordability? How do you improve the affordability of nutritious food? How do you create an enabling public sector environment? Those food-based dietary guidelines I showed you earlier, they're aimed at consumers. They should be aimed at public policy. Public policy often confounds the ability to develop, for consumers to adhere to them. These are the big questions we need researchers like you guys to be focusing on. How do you do this? But to do that, you need to talk to people. You need national and subnational dialogues. Finally, I think the first step to transforming food systems, or transforming anything, is for you to be open to transformation yourself. And I've learned a great deal that I didn't know about food systems from putting myself in this GAIN role. I never really talked to anyone in the business sector before GAIN, seriously. I never really I never really understood finance. I still don't. My colleagues would say I still don't, but I never really understood it. When you're a researcher, you're totally free to work with people that think like you and you like. Right? Am I right? But often you need to talk to people who don't think like you. And sometimes you need to talk to people you don't like, don't even trust, to get things going for nutrition. Thank you. I'm open for questions. Yes. Please, if you shout, I can repeat the question.
Thank you for that very exciting forward-looking talk. And congratulations on your work. Right. I see a problem between supply and demand for nutritious food. When I say supply, if you go around, a lot of junk food supply is there.
Which country do you think?
I'm from India. No, I mean it's happening globally actually. I mean, if I say it's happening in my country, it's also happening as much as, here in US. And how do we stop that? If I remember, when I was a small boy at home, very nutritious food was, balanced food was cooked. There were no restaurants, there were no junk food restaurants. We didn't have to go out, but here we have excess supply. And I'm not sure how do we tackle that. The other question which I thought I'd like to know more of your take on the organic food. What do you think about organic food? Is it more nutritious? Organically grown food.
I'm not an expert on whether organic food is more nutritious or not. I imagine it has, it's probably safer. Probably, I don't know. I'm pleading with I don't know enough about this. If anyone else in the audience does, that'd be good. Sorry. On your first question, I think that's a really important question. The question was basically how do we stem the tide of junk food? I think. So last summer was one of the hottest. I live in the UK in a town called Brighton, which is on the south coast by the sea. And last summer was one of the hottest summers. Hottest in Brighton is nothing compared to here, but it was one of the hottest summers. And so there were loads of newspaper articles. I'm going into it's a roundabout answer to your question. There were lots of newspaper articles about how hot it is in the UK. For some reason, they always show pictures of Brighton Beach. I don't know why. National newspaper. So they were showing these pictures of Brighton Beach, and somebody, one of the journalists, showed a picture of Brighton Beach in 2019 against a picture of Brighton Beach in the last really hot summer, which was in 1976. And so this is completely unscientific, but they just said, look, everyone in this photo is much heavier than everyone in this 1976 photo. And that sort of begs the question, have we all gotten more stupid in terms of our food choices? And of course the answer is no, we haven't all gotten more stupid. The food environment has changed around us, which is your point. Now, can you change that food environment? I guess is the question. I think it is really hard, and I think it will take a multi-pronged approach. We've had some success in our work in Indonesia with what we call emo-demo approach. So demo is demonstration and emo is emotions. So we're trying to use emotions to convince mothers, especially, that this junk food is really awful for their kids. So even in rural Indonesia, you can go to kiosks and buy these big bags in clear big plastic bags of these kind of cheese puff things. And they're actually really tasty. But what our guys do with the community health centers, they get a cup of water and they dissolve this thing in the water. And they pass it around so the mothers can look at it. It looks disgusting. It smells disgusting. And actually, the mothers are actually revolted by it. And so it's proved to be quite effective in sort of changing attitudes about that kind of food. But then the challenge then is to make nutritious food as tasty and as cheap, because that junk food will always be there. So I'm not saying it's easy, but what's the alternative? Give up? No. We have to fight it, and you can fight it through a whole range of subsidies and taxes, demand change behavior, and a whole range of things, but it's not easy, I agree. Shifting demand is the hardest thing in the face of cheap, available, tasty, shiny junk food. Yeah.
I'm Katie Russ from Economics. I'm a trade economist, and I noticed on one of your slides you had a little thing that said globalization, and I was curious how you view globalization as tying in. Is it the accessibility of more affordable junk food? Is it institutions? How do you view that?
I think it's all of the above things, basically. I mean, economic liberalization is way ahead of regulation, and that's what it's all about. But I'm noticing a bit of a backlash against it. So, KFC outlets in Africa, apparently the number of KFC outlets in Africa is still increasing, but it's increasing at a less rapid rate. Now, I don't think that's because they're being saturated, the markets are being saturated. So that's a big part of it, globalizing Western diets. But the flip side of globalization is if we can get it right in a few countries and show the benefits, that might rapidly translate and catch on in other countries. But I haven't thought much about trade, and Gain doesn't think much about trade, so I'd love to talk to you about trade more seriously. I'm wondering whether the codex may be a really important instrument. I haven't thought too much about that.
Thank you for that exciting presentation. One of your slides, you showed that although every country has its own dietary guidelines, some they don't quite agree. So, what is a healthy diet? How do you communicate that to people? Because there's so much different opinion. So, how do you define a healthy diet, and how do you communicate that to people?
Yeah, I'm not a nutritionist, so I don't know if that makes me less likely to be hung up about what exactly a healthy diet is. I think, as I said, the direction of travel is really important. Eat more of this, eat less of that. I guess ultimately it will be really helpful to have a set of consensus dietary guidelines or a consensus statement from WHO and FAO about what is a healthy diet. But it's always going to be very difficult because it's always going to be realized in very different ways in different countries. So I favor a much simpler definition of what is a healthy and sustainable diet. That's even more difficult if you add sustainability into it. But I think, and this may be a very controversial thing to say, I don't know, but I think the fact that we don't have a consensus definition, we have the Eat Lancet definition, but that's not a consensus definition. I think the fact that we don't have a consensus definition shouldn't be an excuse for inaction. So I think very often it is. So yes, it'd be great to have one, but it's nice to have. I don't think it's essential to have, personally.
This may build off the trade question, but one of the issues that you read a lot about is that the developed world basically produces more food than its consumers need. And the reverse is true in much of the undeveloped world. And yet, efforts to try to move food from point A to point B not only has spoilage and carbon footprint issues, but it also has been shown in many instances to crater the local food system where the food's being imported. You could process that food at point A and then ship it, and it would have stability, but then it's processed food. So how does an entity like Gain sort of talk to the stakeholders and raise the awareness about that issue?
I'm an economist, so I believe in comparative advantage. So you don't want to grow something that's really difficult to grow in a country just because you're growing it in your country. So food sovereignty is an issue that we can have a big debate about. Self-sufficiency at the national level, I don't really believe in that. However, I do believe that there are things that countries do have a comparative advantage in terms of their geography, their soils, their climate, that kind of thing. Those markets are potentially high income generation markets for them, and high job creation markets, and actually can produce lots of nutritious food, of which some will stay in the domestic market and not go to the export market. Those kinds of markets are wrecked by excess production due to weird, counterintuitive, or not counterintuitive, counterproductive incentives in some countries. So there is a lot of dumping of food, but dumping of food is different from legitimate exporting of food. So yeah, it's important, but where there's a comparative advantage, we work really hard with the SMEs and with the governments to create stronger markets for those nutritious foods in those locations.
Hi, Beth Mitchum from Plant Sciences. Lawrence, that was a great presentation. I really enjoyed it, learned a lot. I wanted to hear a little bit more about the food systems dashboard that you mentioned. Can you tell us, I didn't quite understand, is it a framework that countries will then be adding data to? That's my first question. And then the follow-up would be, I wanted to hear more about particularly the supply side of that, and what sort of data you envision being entered into that for the supply side.
So the food systems dashboard, it's using existing data. So it's not collecting any new data, it's pulling together extant data from typically global databases. We try to only include data that I think 50 countries is the minimum. If 50 countries have data on it, it goes in. We are trying to figure out how you can set it up so that countries can add in their own. Of course, all the data in global databases comes from the countries, so that's all country data. But when there is data sets that only one country has, or a small handful, how can they add that in? We're trying to figure that out. We don't have an answer for you yet. We're also trying to figure out how can we make this really, if it's a bunch of people from America and Europe descending on Ethiopia, the government of Ethiopia is going to say, get lost. We're not interested in it. We don't trust the data, we don't trust you, we want our own system. So we are now embarking on a series of country pilots where we will work with government and other stakeholders in those countries to say, this is what it looks like at a global comparative level. What does it look like at a uniquely national level? So you may have 50% of the data that's in the global database may be relevant for Ethiopia, but you have another 50% that's unique to Ethiopia. And we want to figure out how it can be really useful for them. So as I said, it's about describing the food system, diagnosing the food system, and then deciding on what the actions are to respond to the diagnosis. And that can only be done at the national level. So the dashboard is a way of getting the dialogue and the conversation started. And it's also a way of giving people a wide-angle lens. In terms of the food supply data, I can't recall actually exactly the details of what that is, but it probably uses quite a bit of FAO data, quite a bit of USDA data, ERS kind of stuff, plus a whole bunch of other stuff. So sorry, I can't remember the exact sources of it. But we tried to screen for quality and relevance. And love to talk to you a bit more about it. I have a beta testing site. If I give you the link, you can play with it. Tell us what you think. Vegetables are in there.
Hi, we hear a lot about the Mediterranean diet and versus the Western diet, and I'm from the region, from the Mediterranean, and I can see that a lot of our diet is eroding because of different constraints that we have, including time. It used to be that mothers mainly prepared food, but now they entered the job market, they don't have time, and we're not seeing what we call food socialization for kids growing up, knowing how to cook and what to cook and how to integrate this diet into their family when they are head of households. So to what extent, in what you're doing, you're integrating culture, changing household mechanisms in terms of working mothers and families, and to what extent we are preserving recipes and food that usually are rich and they are healthy diets, what we refer to, based mainly on like tapas or mesas or whatever. do they still have time to do it? Do they opt for, not just in terms of resources, in terms of money, but we're talking about time and changing workforce?
Yeah, so how do we sort of, how do we counter this, this issue about time poverty and how that means that we go for the quickest fix? Everyone eats at different times, different places. It's really difficult. One of the ways we're thinking about it and exploring it in a couple of our countries, Mozambique, and I can't remember what the other countries we're doing it, is working with chefs. Chefs who are fairly well known throughout the country, because we think that chefs are quite important for setting norms around not just what you eat, but how you eat. I think people trust chefs, so we're doing a lot of that work with them. But the Imo stuff I was telling you about is also working very closely with mothers and talking about the importance. You know, it's not us telling mothers what to do, it's Indonesian colleagues who are working on this, and stressing the importance of eating together and community. The food is not just about nutrients, it's about love, it's about respect and culture. So yes, again, very difficult. It's about norm setting and consumer shifts in consumer attitudes, not just about what is healthy, but how it's consumed. My kids are the worst. I can't change them. They're both adolescents. I don't know if you have this thing called Deliveroo in the US, but it's a delivery service, and it's way too easy for kids to get food delivered to their house. I say to them, you're like emperors. You order food and it comes to the house. It's crazy. It must be the same here. Yeah.
What do you think the role of medical insurance companies, public health systems, the medical profession in general is? The opportunities seem to be somewhat obvious in one way, but there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of enthusiasm or uptake. It's obviously something that's going to be very different in different cultures and different countries, of course, but it would seem that that would be another lever that's interested to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, there's this factoid. I don't know if it's correct, but someone at the Rockefeller Foundation was telling me that in the US, for your training as a doctor, an MD, you're only required to take 7 days training in nutrition out of 7 years study, which is astonishing to me. And I also think our registered dietitians could play a bigger role in resetting norms and being more of a public force for good. If the countries that we worked in had more health insurance policies, I think we would be going very large on can you get reduced premiums if you can somehow demonstrate and record that you're eating healthier foods. I'd be really interested to know what the experience is in the US. I haven't been following that, but it seems highly promising, but maybe the devil is in the detail. I don't know how you essentially confirm or record what you eat. I'm not sure how that works. Or maybe it's linked to weight and blood metrics, I'm not sure.
Yeah, but I was just going to say there's a lot of interest there. There's a lot of hope for technologies, particularly personal devices, to help you make better choices. And there's a lot of people, including some people here, I'm sure, here in the room, working on kind of food informatic related solutions. But what I observe is the status quo in the medical profession, the insurance companies, the pharmaceutical companies, medical device companies. Yeah, there's efforts like healthy eating internally within certain corporations, but there hasn't been a huge effort into, I don't know if you dare even say the words sort of preventative medicine. Is not, it's just not really got much traction at all, because there's,
Hello, thanks. I have a question that's related to the question about what is a healthy diet, more in regards to how that informs policy, which in turn impacts what's fed in schools and prisons and hospitals, et cetera. So my understanding is that the way that protein quality and what's a good source of protein between the US and Canada specifically, just as an example, is applied really differently. And so foods like lentils and beans and peas in Canada are not considered a good source of protein that they are in the US. And that's just a methodological difference.
That sounds extraordinary.
I agree. So maybe we don't need a consensus about what a healthy diet is, but it seems like if we can't even agree on what a good source of protein is, that's a challenge that we need to address. So maybe can you sort of expand on how that might inform policy and what the impacts of that are?
I can't really because no, I can't. I think it would be a great research topic actually. When is the definition of what is a healthy diet a constraint to positive action? I haven't seen it be a constraint to positive action in too many places. So therefore I perhaps don't give it the same weight that you think I should. But your examples are really interesting. I've never heard of that before. So obviously the definitions can matter, but I just haven't seen many examples of it.
Hey, I have one simple but very important question. What do you think, what organization or who can lead the construction of the World Food System? Thank you.
Well, I think there is a world food system, but I think more important is the other national food systems. I think that's where change has to start. So I think governments have to lead the transformation of their food systems, but they have to do it with all the other stakeholders, the businesses, the researchers, the UN families. But they will never do it because they're very busy and they've got lots of other people telling them they need to do X, Y, and Z. So until there's a clamor for change from younger people, from older people, from movements, it won't happen. So change happens when social movements gain power and influence, and they can no longer be ignored. So the food system and unhealthy diets haven't radicalized enough people yet. I'm not sure why that's the case. But I think it's changing. I think it's taken a while for the climate crisis and climate change to become a more radicalized issue. And in fact, I think it makes lots of sense for nutrition folks and people who care about healthy diets to link more with people who care about environments. Because sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes their interests are aligned. And together they'll be much more powerful. And they can learn a lot from the climate movement. And they can learn a lot from the HIV movement. And I think both of those movements use and engage with people who are directly affected. And so I think my example in Bangladesh, I'm hoping that we can mobilize more social movements to demand change. But until that happens, we won't see much change. Sorry, I'm trying to draw attention to you, studiously avoiding it.
Hi, I'm a dietitian working on a project that's more than just an app. It reaches into a whole system that has a researcher portal as well as a clinician portal. And we've been working on it for 10 years. And what's hard is when you look at the databases, and I've looked at many other programs, many other apps, is searching for foods. And they're not going to be widely used by your population unless, if they want an apple, you get apple. Many times you get applesauce, you have to scroll through a whole bunch of foods just to get simple foods. The other thing is cost, is most people are not eating just apples and strawberries, they're eating all the packaged foods. And to get that kind of information, for our project, it would have been $80,000 a year just to buy a source of that kind of information. The other thing is when you start to really deep dive into the data, which most programs haven't, and looking at the quality, if it says 10 grams of protein, is it really 10 grams of protein? And you look at foods and how they analyze for protein multiple ways, fat multiple ways. And so when you're really, I think when we're really looking at outcomes and attaching them, linking them to diet, unless you have very large cohorts, we're going to have to improve our diet data. Thanks very much.
Yeah, diet data are very susceptible, it seems to me, to lots of biases and misreportings, because they're essentially recall data, and even when they're not recall data, they are prone to bias through observation. So I think it is a really difficult area. On buying access to data, are you at the university?
Yeah.
You should get the university to buy the data for you. No, seriously, we for this food system dashboard, we teamed up with Hopkins and a couple of other organizations. We bought the data from this organization, Euromonitor. Maybe that's who you're talking about. But they sell the data, so we got a discounted rate because we teamed up and basically collectively said, give us the data or we're going to make you look bad. And they gave us a discounted rate. So I think you can do that. There was another thing I was going to say, but I can't remember. Sorry. What did you think of my comment about registered dietitians? Ignoring me now. Excuse me, at the back. What did you think of my comment about registered dietitians? What more can you do as a group to reset norms?
Well, as a dietitian, I don't get third-party reimbursement. You know, that's one of them. I mean, it's hard for us to make a living, you know, to really be able to work with the population. That's why, number two, a lot of us aren't trained to work with the population. We're trained for the hospital.
Yes.
And so I think those are two really big ones. It's training and getting reimbursement to the jobs.
Thank you. I didn't talk much about public procurement of food, but public procurement of food is massive. And government buying food for schools, hospitals, prison systems. If governments really wanted to change, they could set the tone by insisting on healthier food in those settings. But again, what's the thing that's driving them to do that? It's got to be clamour, constructive clamour. Yes? Well done.
I've got I was really hoping for some of that. That's for me. In the talk, you mentioned that the role that supermarkets have in shaping people's preferences, and also the need for consumers being supported by government incentives, which made me think of a quite dramatic trend that's happened in the last few years, particularly in the UK and Germany, but also here in California, of an interest in moving towards a plant-based diet, or a predominantly plant-based diet. We're coming towards the end of January, which in the UK has been a Veganuary movement, huge amount of interest, and people citing sort of healthy diet and also the environment to connect with the climate question. And obviously there's sort of Subway, KFC, Burger King, all kinds of retailers getting involved in this. I wondered if you, in the organisation, have had some thoughts on how sort of this change has happened quite dramatically, quite quickly, without the involvement of, say, government incentives, without apparently sort of supermarkets leading, but actually consumers potentially driving. Are there any interesting sort of stories or sort of lessons you've learned from that? And do you think it's a positive thing for diets, and do you think it's where do you think this should take its head?
What do I think what is a positive thing for diets?
So there's this switch in Western countries towards a predominantly plant-based diet amongst, say, 10-15% of the population.
I think for many groups in high-income countries, it is a positive thing. There are thresholds above which you shouldn't consume animal source foods. So it's unhealthy. And subject to the problems of diet quality that we were talking about earlier. You know, one systematic review this week says eating red meat is not so bad for you, and another week says it is bad for you, and you're sort of left scratching your head. But I think it is, I think the science would, I'm not a nutritionist, Christine can answer that question, but on balance, I think the science would say it's a good thing to eat.
And what about happening without government support or incentives, given that you mentioned that's one sort of important reason or area of action?
I think I'm not sure. I think the demand for healthy food it's going to be difficult to put back in the box. I think governments have been quite important in not getting in the way. In the UK is worried about. Well, I think the sugar tax in the UK was very important. It's only focusing on sugar, but it's signalling to the food companies that the UK government is really interested in regulating bad foods. And so the companies I took to see the sugar tax as a vision of what's to come, of the thin end of the wedge. So I think that has been really important in the UK. And I think government attempts to get healthier meals in schools have also been important. But I agree that civil society and people in general have played a really important role. I mentioned chefs earlier. I'm doing some work with the Jamie Oliver Foundation in the UK, and I'm just amazed at what level of engagement he can command from government, businesses, and we're working with kids. The campaigns are great. It's about tell the truth to us. Don't rip us off, companies and governments. So I think that's very powerful. I think it's not going to go away. But I think governments, the UK has been quite important. UK governments have been quite important. Not as effective as we like, but in the UK it's been the most important. The sugar tax in the UK, I would say, is the most effective one out there. Yeah, because it's not a tax, it's a levy. It's a direct levy on companies.
I was thinking specifically in relation to this switch amongst a lot of people towards plant-based diets, not having any government support, encouraging that shift to be people on their own driving it. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think I would. I'm not convinced of how big a switch it is yet.
We're out of time. So, if I might, I would just like to ask you to join me in thanking our speaker today. I would also like to thank the Vice Chancellor for organizing this event. We're very happy that you've enabled us to invite Lawrence to come today. And for everyone, please help yourself to the reception that we have just outside. And thank you all for coming.